Live now.
Let's go.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Wednesday, July 7th, 2021. My name is Sam Seder. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Mark Joseph Stern, Slate staff writer, Justice and the Courts, on the Supreme Court's assault on our democracy. Also on the program today, Brian Concannon, Executive Director at Project Bluelight, Advisor to the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti, on the assassination of Haitian President Jovenel Moïse. Meanwhile, in this country, the Delta variant, now the dominant strain of COVID. COVID is surging, meanwhile, in immigrant detention centers throughout the country. Biden to sign an executive order to encourage the Federal Trade Commission to ban or limit non-compete clauses. Could be a big deal. Monopsony drives down wages. In New York City, we have a winner in the Democratic mayoral primary, which is almost like saying we have a winner in the mayoral race, period. Eric Adams, likely to be New York's next mayor. The RNC was hacked allegedly by Russian hackers. Odd choice for Hillary Clinton to perpetrate that and promote that. But new data show uninsured get higher prices from hospitals. In the Senate and House, Warren and Rokana demand the Defense Department review its civilian casualty numbers from 2020. Nancy Pelosi's husband bought $5 million in Google stock, really actually Alphabet, just as there are antitrust measures that are trying to be pushed through the House. CIA director makes a secret visit to Brazil to meet with the Bolsonaro government, as that government is under siege for its corruption. All this and more on today's program. I failed to say at the top of the show that we are not breaking format, adjusting format. We do that all the time. I mean, I guess it's our format's relatively loose here anyways. But in the fun half, the second half of the program today, at least in the first hour of the fun half, I will be hosting Yaron Brook. He is my understanding is that he is the current chairman of the board at the Ayn Rand Institute. And he had reached out to a mutual friend, or Ben Burgess. He wanted to debate me, I guess, in the wake of the Steven Crowder situation, and I said, of course. And so that's going to happen in the second hour. I'm not sure exactly what he wanted to debate me on. We didn't really get into the details, but I presume it's that he wants to argue that libertarianism is the best. Something other than what?
Something other than the motivated reasoning of oligarchy?
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that's on the that was one of the first questions I was going to ask him was, is this not the motivated reasoning of the oligarchy? And then take it from there.
What is the over-under on terms of minutes on when he will bring up cryptocurrency into the conversation?
Oh, I don't think he'll do that. I don't get that sense. He seems like an old school, although I don't know. But I mean, he's on the board of directors of Ayn Rand. So, but he may throw it in there like, I'll bet you an Ethereum coin or something like that.
You're like, sure, I'll take that bet on that completely made up currency.
I mean, look there. You bet me a specific baseball card too, I might bite. Frankly, if I know it has some value. So let's turn to this. We're in the midst of a very strange period in our politics, very, very narrow. I mean, there's ongoing negotiations about the bipartisan infrastructure deal, ongoing intra-Democratic Party negotiations, where a lot of people are finding themselves as the new Joe Manchin because there's such a small margin, where they're negotiating on the infrastructure deal that will happen under reconciliation. And the right, the conservatives, the Republicans seem to be barely engaging in this, what could be massive change in policy and have massive policy implications. And instead, they are obsessed and focused with the fictional notion that critical race studies is being taught in elementary schools as a way of expressing anger that there has been a revisitation over the past 5 or 6 years, maybe more, maybe less, on questions like, hey, why do we have these monuments to literally a war that was fought on behalf of trying to maintain slavery? Why, why don't we teach things like Reconstruction? Why do grown adults in the United States have no awareness of the multiple massacres that took place in the years after Reconstruction as a way to diminish Black power and Black wealth?
Why do 8% of high school seniors not understand that slavery was the main cause of the Civil War, was the cause of the Civil War? And
all of these things are, we're going through a period of looking back on our history and anticipating it. And there are cultural changes, and there's really no way to address that without sounding like you're being racist. So instead, you make up the idea that a legal theory that is taught in law schools is being taught in elementary schools. And you use it as a catch-all that can be expanded. You can also throw in communism and Marxism into it, and cultural Marxism.
And you get to, make sure that the grassroots Republican base is engaged on like an incredibly micro level when it comes to their school board, and that gets them to engage in other types of conservative politics, helping the agenda. I mean, it's ingenious in many ways. They found their new cultural catch-all, as you say, in the Biden era.
Right. And they'll, in 4 or 5 years, it'll be something completely different, I assure you, and also probably equally as based in race. But just like slightly more submerged. It won't be political correctness. It won't be cancel culture. It'll move into the next thing and whatnot. But the other aspect of that is that there is no Republican agenda. Reminder, the Republican platform, as irrelevant as these documents might be in the context of governing, although I don't think they're quite as irrelevant as some people think, they are at least a statement of the party's principles. You go back and you look like Texas Republican platform, always lunacy And if you go back like 10, 15 years, you can see that that lunacy has now been adopted by the rest of the Republican Party. This past year, it was nothing but we support Donald Trump, period, end of story. We don't have to do any, like no more writing, and the printing costs are down. And we can see that abject fealty on display on Fox News yesterday. J.D. Vance, the supposed more sort of like thoughtful conservative, sort of like populist conservative, like the one who understood the dynamic of what was happening, but was responsible and thoughtful. Well, now he's running for office. And so, of course, that all gets jettisoned. And what he has to do is go and take the knee and ask for the forgiveness of Donald Trump. This is like one of those like Jane Goodall videos where you see the gorillas holding out their hand to show their fealty. Here it is, J.D. Vance on Fox News.
You met with former President Trump earlier this year. It's a coveted endorsement in these primaries for sure. And as you know, there are reports out there that say that you have these deleted tweets that come from 2016 where you heavily criticized the president, that you were voting for somebody else. One, can you confirm for us that those were in fact your tweets and that you did in fact delete them? And if so, what's changed?
Sure. Well, like a lot of people, I criticized Trump back in 2016, and I'd ask folks not to judge me based on what I said in 2016, because I've been very open about the fact that I did say those critical things, and I regret them, and I regret being wrong about the guy. I think that he was a good president. I think he made a lot of good decisions for people, and I think he took a lot of flack. And as you probably appreciate, Alicia, you know, I've taken a lot of flack myself over the last few years for standing up for the president's voters, but also standing up for the agenda. And I think that's the most important thing, is not what you said 5 years ago, but whether you're willing to stand up and take the heat and take the hits for actually defending the interests of the American people, because that's what this business of politics should be all about.
Are you concerned that this is going to become a gift to some of your primary challengers?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sure they'll use it against me. And of course, I think they have baggage of their own when it comes to President Trump and when it comes to other issues. But I think my advantage in this race is that we're talking, and I'm talking about real issues. That's the most important thing.
Not to the Republican primary voter. It's not. Sad. Very, very sad. The bootlicker, Jesus.
The idea of taking the heat and taking the hits. Here's a question that I would ask. Well, then why did you delete them?
Yeah, somebody who takes the heat doesn't apologize. You just take the heat.
Well, but also, like, what were you hoping to do by deleting those tweets? I mean, if you're going to take the heat and take responsibility for the fact that you were in some way less than laudatory towards our dear leader, why did you delete them? Or another question would have been like, when did you have this change of heart?
Yeah, can I just read one of the tweets? In October 2016, Trump makes people I care about afraid, immigrants, Muslims, etc. Because of this, I find him reprehensible. Like, I'm curious about, like, were you wrong then? Or was the fact that Trump was such a good president make it, worth it that he scared those immigrants and Muslims?
Yeah, the over 600,000 dead might disagree with his assessment on his presidency, but...
I'm just curious as to what the good decisions he made were that were helpful to Muslims and to immigrants, or what the decisions, and at what point did JD see the light? I mean, that would be an interesting thing to examine. But there it is. If you want to understand what the modern Republican Party is about, and just to be clear, that's not authoritarianism.
No,
right?
But let me just quickly say too, like, that's so perfect to say what the modern Republican Party is about, right? He bent the knee to Trump. He has to show that he expressed his adoration for Trump. And just a few, the Jane Goodall experience. But just years before, when his book came out, Hillbilly Elegy, he was being heralded as the voice for the true red America that the New York Times and that liberals on the coast wanted to perceive red America as. So much like the Lincoln Project, these kinds of conservative voices were fetishized. They're very different, but they all come around. The Lincoln Project was a grift. They wasted all their money. They enriched themselves. They also had no effect on the election. And then J.D. Vance comes around and licks the boot of Trump. All of these facile notions that liberals create to make themselves feel better about who the Republicans are, what the Republican Party is, they always come crashing down eventually.
All right, we got to take a quick break. We'll be right back, and we'll be talking to Mark Joseph Stern when we return. Hey, folks, 2 days in a row. I hope Harry's didn't think I was going to be shaving both days, but when I do shave, I shave with Harry's. And now Harry's is offering our listeners their starter set at harrys.com/majority. Told you this before. Harry's delivers a close, comfortable shave, and they do it at a real, legit, fair price, as low as $2 per refill. Their blades are designed to stay sharp. They bought their own factory in Germany that's been making precision-engineered blades for over 100 years. Guys who shave 4 times a week said their 8th shave was as smooth as their first. And so for guys like me who shave only twice a week, I get a blade, I'd make them last.
Oh, now it's twice a week, huh?
I know I shave it yeah, twice a week. Once at the beginning, once towards the end. Sure. I'm not going to shave 2 days in a row, though. But when I do, it's with Harry's. Why? They've got a weighted ergonomic handle. They got their signature blade cartridge, narrow for my asymmetrical nostrils. It's a smart, simple razor designed for delivering a close shave all along the contours of your face. And they stand behind the quality of their blades so much that you get a 100% money-back guarantee on harrys.com. I love Harry's. They've been very supportive of this program, and they've been very supportive of my face. I'm not suggesting that the narrower blade head was made specifically for me, but it does work specifically for me. Harry's is giving their best offer to Majority Report listeners. New Harry's customers can get a starter set at harrys.com/majority. You get a 5-blade razor, a weighted ergonomic handle, foaming shave gel, travel blade cover, a $13 value for just $3. There has never been a better time to try Harry's. Go to harrys.com/majority to redeem your offer today. Also, this is exciting. Summer's here. Great time to read. This summer is yours for the taking. If you've always wanted to read more, you can empower your inner reader with the Literati Book Club, where you read alongside the world's most inspiring authors and leaders. I've had a great experience with Literati for Saul. They have book clubs for kids, and now they have them for adults. You can join Malela or Stephen Curry or Richard Branson and more on their next reading adventure. Author, leaders, and activists, they spark lively conversations in 12 unique book clubs, and Literati delivers their monthly book picks straight to your door. That means you can talk to Stephen Curry about his favorite books with him, Emma.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I know.
So some fun pronunciations you had going on.
What? Is it not Stephen Curry?
Well, I mean, I'm assuming it's Steph Curry, right? The basketball player. So.
Yeah. Steph Curry? All right, fine, whatever. You find exclusive interviews. I mean, I know he's a great basketball player. Richard Branson, I said right, and I know he's the Virgin.
Also
guy.
a great basketball player.
Not so much. Malela, maybe she's a good basketball player. I don't think.
No, it was Malala. That's what you're talking about. Okay, just sorry. Keep going.
All book club members can shop the entire Literati library at discounts with many books over 50% off. And here's the best part. You can move freely between clubs, or you can use the standard membership to access everything and choose the books you want delivered. Reimagine what a book club can be. Redeem your free trial at literati.com/majority report. Head to literati.com/majority report to learn more and read more with Literati. Literati.com/majority report. Check it out, folks. And lastly, people are looking to go out right now, starting to get back to normal a little bit. Still got to be careful. The Delta variant's out there, but if you're vaccinated, the implications of that Delta variant, much, much less severe. But the bottom line, you're going to have people going out and seeing movies and going out to restaurants and going to see live music and, of course, going to the post office. What? Yeah, no, maybe you don't want to necessarily go to the post office, run some of those errands that you don't want to spend your time doing. Well, luckily with stamps.com, you can skip those trips to the post office. Why? Because you can mail and ship anytime, anywhere, right from your computer. You can send letters, you can ship packages, you can pay less with discounted rates from the USPS, it's the United States Postal Service, and UPS. You can print official U.S. postage and shipping labels using a standard printer, and you can do this 24/7, 365. Stamps.com is saving nearly 1 million small business owners like you time and money. They've got a switch and save feature. You can compare carriers to find the best rates every single time. This was crucial back in the days when I was sending out, DVDs and whatnot for membership, all that stuff way back in the day. Stop wasting time going to the post office. Go to stamps.com instead. There's no risk. With my promo code Majority Report, you get a special offer that includes a 4-week trial plus free postage and a digital scale. There's no long-term commitments. There's no long-term contracts. Just go to stamps.com, click on the microphone at the top of the homepage, type in Majority Report. That's stamps.com, promo code Majority Report, stamps.com. You will never have to leave your home again. But you want to, and you don't have to go to the post office. Want to welcome back to the program Mark Joseph Stern. He is the Slate staff writer, Justice, who writes about the justice and the courts. Here with Emma Vigeland. Mark, thank you so much for coming today.
Of course, always a pleasure, Sam.
We spoke about less than a week ago, I think it was. And while we were talking, the court was just about announcing 2 rulings, which you were heavily anticipating. And I suspect that you thought they were going to be bad, and they were not great.
They were bad, yes.
And these are, genuine assaults on our democracy in a real structural way that are not acute in the sense that, people can argue that the insurrection was an assault on our democracy. This is something that is going to be durable and lasting, and I think get worse. Let's start with, I don't know which one you want to start with. It's either Brnovich versus the DNC or Americans for Prosperity versus Bonta. Which one? I don't know. Which one's worse?
So I think if you take these 2 cases together, they stand for the proposition that the Supreme Court has made it easier to buy elections in secret and harder to vote in them. I think we should start with the voting case, Brnovich v. DNC, because Americans for Prosperity, it takes a little bit more explanation to sort of connect the dots. Brnovich is a straightforward attack on the Voting Rights Act, one that I think was widely misreported as being not so bad, but at least in my view and in the view of a lot of voting rights experts, it is a really terrible decision that will have ramifications for years, if not decades to come.
This is consistent with John Roberts. What's amazing about this is that to have a career where 30, 40 years ago, you can be telling the president of the United States, hey, we need to sink this Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And then 40 years later, to find yourself in the position of being literally one of 5 or 6 people in the world who can unilaterally do it. This would be a really heartwarming story for John Roberts if it wasn't so horrific for our democracy.
Yes, that's correct. So just to kind of flesh out what you noted there, back in 1982, John Roberts was a young, idealistic foot soldier in the Reagan Revolution at the Justice Department, who was already very hostile to voting rights. And one of his main issues at the Justice Department was fighting an amendment to the Voting Rights Act that Congress was considering that would prohibit any voting restriction that results in the disproportionate disenfranchisement of racial minorities. And I think it's really important to zero in on this language, right? So the 15th Amendment passed after the Civil War bans intentional race discrimination in voting. So, if Mississippi says Black people can't vote, that's unconstitutional. And in 1980, the Supreme Court had interpreted the Voting Rights Act to only encompass what the 15th Amendment encompasses, intentional race discrimination. The problem is that today, and back then too, very few legislators go onto the floor of the State House and say, I hate Black people and I don't want them to vote. And that's why I'm passing this voter suppression law. Voter suppression laws are dressed up in neutrality. And so Congress was responding to that bad decision in 1980 by banning laws that also result in a disparate impact on racial minorities' ability to vote, even if you can't prove that the goal, the intent, the aim was to suppress minorities' votes. That's what John Roberts hated back in 1982 and lobbied against. It did ultimately pass, but as you noted, 40 years later, John Roberts gets to be one of the 6 people who then turns around and essentially rewrites and dismantles this really important amendment to the Voting Rights Act, which was pretty much all we had left to stand in the way of the raft of voter suppression laws passed in the wake of 2020.
And we should say, one of the things that's a little bit ironic is we're having this massive fake debate over critical race studies right now. And the concept of something can be racist in result, even if there is no intent. Never mind proving it. Even if there's no intent, there's no feeling of like I'm a racist and I don't want Black people to vote. Or even if it's like I'm a racist and I don't care whether Black people get the right to vote if it helps me at the long run. It's the result. And so you're preventing people from using proxies as a way of it's like saying I want to. We're not targeting Latino people, but we're only going to say people whose last name is, let's say, Ramirez can't vote. You have a fairly good notion that like a high percentage of the people that and that is this proxy notion to fight that. So how did they attack the Section 2, even though it was explicit in the ratification in 1982?
So what Justice Alito did in his majority opinion was create all of these new factors that courts have to go through when assessing a Section 2 Voting Rights Act claim. And the factors are designed to ensure that almost any law will be upheld. And to explain why, let me just sort of walk you through the main points here. First of all, Alito says, well, if there was a law that was common in 1982, then it's probably legal today because that's the backdrop against which Congress passed this law. So that's the baseline for voting. Two big problems there. First of all, Congress passed this law in 1982 because it thought there was a lot of race discrimination in voting that was getting approved because plaintiffs couldn't prove discriminatory intent. So the idea itself totally contradicts the history of this law. The second problem, relatedly, is that back in 1982, early voting and absentee voting were nearly unheard of. They were severely restricted by almost every state. Almost everybody had to vote on election day. Absentee voting and early voting are relatively modern inventions, and widespread early voting and absentee voting are really pretty new as of the last decade or so. So what Alito has done is ensure that all of these attacks on the franchise that came after 2020, which take the form of cuts to early voting, cuts to absentee voting, really drastic restrictions on when and how people can vote, almost all of those laws will now be upheld because they weren't common in 1982. And so according to Alito, they're not the kind of thing that Congress wanted to ban.
Can you talk, just really quickly, can you talk about the appeals court or the appeal that in Arizona that led Alito to this decision, or essentially that he ignored? Because I think some of that context is really important to understanding the decision.
Absolutely. So the case specifically dealt with two laws passed by Republicans in Arizona. And I think I want to note that even though it's important to talk about this, and you're absolutely right that they're important for the context, at the end of the day, this case is about so much more than just these two laws, right? But Arizona Republicans passed a ban on ballot collection by third parties, which just means family members or community leaders used to go around in Arizona and collect people's ballots and turn them over to election officials. Zero proof of any fraud resulting from this practice. And one of the reasons it was so popular is that Arizona has a lot of indigenous people. There are a lot of people who live in tribal reservations where there is severely limited access to the postal service. There's no postal offices. There's not even regular mail. And an individual might have to drive for hours to get to the nearest precinct or post office. So a lot of community elders would gather ballots from people and drive and do the work and turn them over en masse to election officials. Arizona Republicans banned that, understanding well that the vast majority of indigenous voters are Democrats. Similarly, Arizona decided to invalidate all ballots that are cast out of precinct. So in some Arizona counties, you have to go to this specific precinct to vote. If you go to the wrong precinct, you might still get the right ballot. You might be voting in almost all, if not all, of the correct races, but Arizona will invalidate your ballot altogether. And for reasons that remain very mysterious, precincts for Hispanic and Black communities tend to be much farther away than precincts in white communities. In fact, Hispanic voters in Arizona would sometimes have to drive past precincts for white communities to get to the ones assigned to them. And so understandably, this law had a wildly disproportionate impact on Hispanic voters whose ballots were disregarded because of this rule exponentially more frequently than white people's ballots. And so the Court of Appeals in this case looked at those laws and said, hey, we can't necessarily prove that they're passed with discriminatory intent, although they did think that the ballot collection ban was passed with racist intent. But the court said either way, this has a disparate impact on racial minorities, and so it violates the Voting Rights Act. And that is the decision that the Supreme Court by a 6-3 vote overturned, saying, in fact, both of these laws are absolutely hunky-dory.
What a mystery as to why those voting places would be so far away from the actual voters. And just to be clear on what you had said earlier about Alito and saying with that 1982 thing, I want people to understand this is the functional equivalent of a plumber coming in to fix a leak, and the leak still being there after the plumber's gone, and goes, well, that was the baseline. The leak existed there. Like, my coming here and fixing it, you should not judge it against anything other than what it was in the first place, right? Like, Section 2 was updated because of the laws that existed at the time, not as an acceptance of the laws at the time. Why else would you have Section 2?
Right. And we should just be clear that there's nothing in the text of this law that supports Alito's reading. For a court of ostensible textualists, this is just riffing. And Justice Kagan in her dissent calls Alito's opinion a law-free zone. And I think that's exactly right. And I'll give you another example, a factor that Alito introduces here. He says that if the state decides to restrict or even ban a certain method of voting. So say a state decides to ban all early voting across the board. That's not necessarily illegal as long as people have another method of voting that's available to them. So if it's still easy to vote, if they can still go on election day in person and vote, if there are other opportunities, then this ban or restriction on one particular method isn't illegal, even if it's the method that is disproportionately favored by a specific racial minority. And by banning it, you are placing a disproportionate burden on those individuals' ability to cast a ballot.
And lastly, because I want to move on to the other case, but he also sort of questioned the concept on some level of racial disparity, didn't he? Or watered it down by implying that, like, there's a lot of other things that you could blame on this disparity.
Right. So Alito questions the existence, really, of racially disparate impacts altogether. He doesn't accept this concept of racially disparate impacts. He thinks that it's kind of an offensive idea. This is something Clarence Thomas has railed against as well. I don't think he has the votes to totally obliterate it as a concept, but what he says is, well, if there's just small differences, if 98% of people can still vote, and most of those individuals are not having issue casting a ballot, then we're not going to step in and we're not going to let the federal courts step in. The problem with that kind of reasoning is that it may be that the entire 2% of people who can't vote may be racial minorities. It may be that you have restricted all of the ways that racial minorities prefer to vote. And so, yes, it may only affect 2% of the population, but that is more than enough to swing an election. And if it's a disparate impact on racial minorities, we know which way it's going to swing the election. So really an attack on the kind of foundational idea that Congress had when amending this law in 1982, questioning the idea that evidence of hugely disparate impacts on minorities counts for anything when you're suing under the VRA.
Well, maybe Stephen Breyer's abject narcissism will provide him the seventh vote that he needs for that. All right, let's talk about the Americans for Prosperity versus Bonta. This, if the words of Anthony Kennedy in Citizens United echo in my head over and over again. Well, it's something to the effect of, at least we have disclosure. If we didn't have disclosure, there would be a problem with this corporate money. And here we are.
Yes. So this is a case about donor disclosures in California, specifically people who give a ton of money to charities, including partisan political charities. So the plaintiff here was Americans for Prosperity, which is a Koch-run charity, right? But they're registered as a nonprofit in California. California passed this law that requires charities to turn over the names of their very high dollar donors to the state attorney general. The state attorney general uses that information to prevent charitable fraud. A quarter of all charities are located in California in this country. Charitable fraud is a real and serious problem, and it often takes the form of charities promising donors one thing and then doing something totally different with their money. So the idea here was, well, the attorney general is going to follow up with donors, make sure that the money is actually being used for what it's being promised for. The Supreme Court strikes down that entire law on its face, not just as applied to charities that face serious threats of retaliation to their donors, but every single charity, and says this violates the First Amendment freedom of association, which, by the way, is not really in the First Amendment. It's a sort of penumbra you have to find. If you gaze deeply into the First Amendment, you can extract this freedom of association. The Chief Justice said people will be too scared to give money because they don't want their names turned over to the California Attorney General. People will decline to associate with these organizations. So the court has to subject any kind of disclosure law to something that looks a lot like strict scrutiny, really heightened, intense judicial scrutiny. And Roberts, in his majority opinion, said this law doesn't pass it because basically there's no evidence that California is going to use the information correctly, and the law is not sufficiently tailored to address the needs that the state has put forward. Which, to translate all that, as Sotomayor put it in dissent, the court has put a huge bullseye on all disclosure laws, specifically including election and campaign finance disclosure laws, which is what this case is really about if you read between the lines.
How can they, so what is the standard for the strict scrutiny as it's applied here, and how can they say it doesn't reach that, it doesn't pass that threshold, considering that was almost like the leverage point for allowing unlimited corporate donations in the first place?
Right, exactly. That was the theory behind Citizens United, and the court upheld disclosures there by an 8-1 vote and said, don't worry, we're all good with disclosure laws. But here, the court turns around and jacks up the standard. And what's key, the move here to understand, is that the court says any kind of disclosure law has to be subject to narrow tailoring. So it has to be as narrowly tailored as possible to satisfy the government's important interests in whatever it's trying to achieve. Narrow tailoring is a really strict test because you can always fly spec the government's justification for a law and say, well, you could have made this even narrower. You could have excluded more groups. You could have set a higher threshold. You could have done all this stuff that you didn't do, and so we don't think this satisfies strict scrutiny. And that is a new rule, because in the old days, it used to be that you would only get to that level of scrutiny if the individual fighting the disclosure rule had proved that they were facing actual harm, that people were harassing them for their free association, that people were threatening them with violence. only then could you get a foot in the door. What Roberts did is get rid of that threshold requirement that you prove you're actually facing retaliation or harassment, and say anyone who doesn't want to disclose information to the government, all you have to do is raise a challenge to a law on its face, say it's not narrowly tailored, and in short, you will win.
I mean, this seems to just, it seems to have potential implications even beyond the disclosures that come with contributing to political organizations, to political, I mean, like, the government requires some information from you that ends up being, you know, somewhat public, right? I mean, like, this seems to, in some ways, again, another assault on sort of government's ability to regulate, just through
Absolutely.
another direction.
Absolutely. So you can imagine, say, a business telling the government, we don't want to turn over our worker pay. We don't want to disclose that information to you because we think we'll leak it. And other businesses will seize upon it to either provide more competitive pay or cut costs or whatever. And as soon as a business raises that challenge, in theory, the government's going to have to prove that this regular, boring, vanilla regulation that's probably been on the books for decades satisfies this super strict standard of review. But I do think that right now, what Roberts is setting his sights on are these campaign finance laws that require disclosure of people who've donated money to a candidate or a campaign, because this opinion really just tees up a future decision where the court will say, you know, we don't think that a requirement of disclosures for donors who gave over $1,000 satisfies this heightened scrutiny, because $1,000 isn't that much. And the government hasn't proven that $1,000 can corrupt any candidate. And without that evidence, we're going to strike this down. The next case, $5,000, the next case, $25,000. At some point, the court basically just rules out the possibility of disclosure laws altogether.
And I mean, and I know this is tangential, but you know, the way they work is they're teeing up stuff that may be reversed, you know, 3, 4, 5 years down the road. Like in New York City, I imagine they have it in other places. You know, the Board of Health gives a grade on how clean your restaurant is. I mean, it seems to me like, well, you disclose that to the public, it could hurt our business. I mean, it's one thing for the Board of Health to come in and say, here's a grade, you've got to raise it. But I mean, do you really need to tell the public?
Right. And one thing that's important to note here, and we talked about this in the context of Cedar Point, the union case, right? It's not just about these particular facts, and it's not just about precisely what's required and what's not. It's about making regulation so burdensome and so expensive for the government that the government just gives up. The government does not have an army of lawyers like many of these businesses and politicians who are willing to defend their interests for, you know, ever. The government doesn't have an endless army of lobbyists or an endless amount of resources to fight this battle. It is a David versus Goliath kind of battle. And at the end of the day, I think your example is a good one. There's a good chance that the government will just give up rather than trying to protect these disclosure rules. And that is maybe what I'm most afraid of here. Not just that the government will keep losing in court, but that the government will stop trying because it can't afford to keep fighting these battles at all.
Plenty of examples of this. You see it with the IRS going after low-income people as opposed to high-income people. You see it in the context of Dodd-Frank, where all these lawyers came in and fought the imposition of Dodd-Frank laws. Mark Joseph Stern, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. I can't thank you enough.
Thanks so much for having me on.
All right, folks, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to be talking to Brian Concannon, who was able to join us last minute notice, actually, Mark as well, both very appreciative of both of them making their time for us today. But just remember these court cases, folks, because we're going to be talking about these cases a lot over the next coming years, because these are the first steps in a series of cases that are going to diminish the ability of our government to protect citizens, to protect citizens as consumers, to protect workers. It is, and there is very little that we can do about it at this point, short of, expanding the Supreme Court, which is, it is a dead idea at this moment anyways. It may pick up steam over the course of the next 3 or 4 years. I don't know, but rather scary. All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be talking to Brian Concannon. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report here with Emma Vigeland, and I want to welcome back to the program Brian Concannon. He is the executive director at Project Blueprint. He's an advisor to the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti. Brian, we spoke not too long ago. The time escapes me. There was a lot of unrest in Haiti, as there very often is, frankly, and political turmoil because the president at the time, Jovenel Moïse, was, I don't know how you would say it. He was sort of very hesitant to leave. And he was assassinated last night in his home. Set the context for us before we actually go into the assassination itself.
Sure, Sam. When we spoke, first of all, thanks for having me on. It's good to be with you. When we spoke back in March, President Moïse was not only hesitating to leave, he was systematically dismantling Haiti's democracy. And unfortunately, he was doing it with the support of the international community, including the United States. That continued through April, May, and June. Things in Haiti had gotten much worse. July was already a month marked by political violence, in a year marked by political violence. And this is just the latest of those. It unfortunately puts Haiti in a really tough place. I spoke with a human rights activist this morning and asked how she was doing, and she said, "This is worse than we ever could have imagined." And this is a country that's really suffered an immense amount, and people have pretty good imaginations about worst case scenarios. Haiti's now left with a pretty strong power vacuum. The Constitution has a roadmap for how you replace a president, but most of the roads on that map have been closed. You're supposed to have the National Assembly elect a president within 60 days. The National Assembly is like a joint Congress in the United States, where you get the Senate and the House of Representatives together, but almost all the seats in Haiti's legislature, except for 10 senators, are vacant. The Supreme Court can have a role here, but the Supreme Court Chief Justice passed away from COVID last week. Half of the seats on the court are vacant. And so really throughout the government, the type of structures that you would rely on to give you resiliency in these times have been dismantled.
So can you talk about how, I mean, just a little bit more background, how the country's, previous president Martelly, he tapped Moïse, and that was around 2016, 2017, and he had the backing of the Clintons, very aggressively, it seemed, and thus that carried over to Moïse and the Trump administration, and seemingly, at least publicly, with the Biden administration. So we're still learning information, but it sounds like there was at least one American voice in terms of the mercenaries that attacked him, according to early reports. What role potentially could the U.S. have played in this? Because he, despite dismantling all these democratic institutions, was clearly, a part of the folds of the United States foreign policy apparatus.
That's a really good point, Emma. Haitians connect those same dots. When they're talking about what's happening today, they go back to 2010 when Secretary of State Clinton pushed Haiti's electoral council to change the results of the elections. So Michel Martelly came in third of those elections, which meant he should not have been in the runoff. But Secretary Clinton, under a threat of revoking everybody's U.S. visas, said that they needed to change the President or Michel Martelly's place, and they obeyed, and Martelly became president. He did not get there with the support of the Haitian people, so he ran his office as if he had no popular support. He built up a very corrupt political machine to keep himself in power, and the machine was strong enough that he was able to transfer power to President Moïse in an election where fewer than 20% of Haitian registered voters even bothered to participate because they knew a sham when they saw it. Since then, Moïse has continued to consolidate power and as we discussed last March, really been dismantling the structures of accountability. That includes courts, that includes anti-corruption mechanisms, it includes going after journalists, going after lawyers. Really any voice that could hold the government accountable was suppressed. And unfortunately, the United States was behind that all the way. I mean, going back to President Martelly, we felt that Martelly was someone we could work with. The same with Moïse. And so ever since then, for both administrations, we've been providing generous financial support. We've been providing diplomatic support, making sure that the OAS and the United Nations continue to support both Moïse and Martelly. And so we're in a situation where the United States has supported the gathering of all of Haiti's political parties in the hands of one person. And now that person is dead. And so it really puts Haiti in a tough position. It does provide an opportunity for the United States. I think we can hopefully learn from this experience, and we can support a democratic Haiti, one where we care about processes, where we care about fairness rather than caring about who is in charge. Because one of the things that people are concerned about now is that the U.S. is going to pick a leader, pick someone that the U.S. thinks is the best place to lead Haiti out of this, and support that person rather than an inclusive process that will create a legitimate president.
Before we get into any type of like a sense of who might have done this, and I have to say, like it is surprising. I mean, there's other examples, but to see an assassination of someone who does have the backing of the United States, right? I mean, history for the most part has been, when you see an assassination or a coup attempt, and to the extent that there is a great interest in it by the United States, they tend to have involvement on the side of the one doing the killing rather than being killed, or being dispossessed or flown out of the country. But before we get to that, reiterate for us, I know we talked about this a bit in March, but what is the U.S. interest in having having this type of hegemony over Haiti? I mean, because it is, there may be a natural desire for the United States to have hegemony over every country, but there is a more acute desire, it seems to me, when it comes to Haiti. That is obviously, and there's a long history of this, but what is it? Is it just, are we just talking about commodities?
Very good question. And you asked that of Jemima Pierre when she was on the show with me, and she gave a wonderful answer that I'll try to recap as best I can. I mean, the basic point is that Haiti has always been a bad example that the U.S. needed to eradicate. That started in 1804 when Haiti was insisting on being a free country and a country born of slaves who freed themselves in a world that was dominated by slaveholding powers, including the United States. So the U.S. would not even recognize Haiti, and Haiti was the second independent country in the Americas. So you would think that we would embrace Haiti with open arms. We did not until just a few weeks after our own Emancipation Proclamation in 1862. That was really what allowed us to at least recognize Haiti. But since then, we've continued to punish Haiti. Haiti is the country that had the longest marine occupation in the hemisphere. We've overthrown several presidents. Haiti's had 33 coups d'etats. The U.S. has been involved in a bunch of them. We supported the Duvalier dictatorship. We supported the dictatorship that ousted President Aristide in 2004. We continue to support Presidents Martelly and Moïse. And I think what we're most worried about is that Haiti is going to give us an example of real popular democracy, because that's what Haitians keep insisting on doing, that we have a democracy where the people actually get to choose their policies rather than corporations, rather than foreign interests, rather than economic elites. And that's something that presidents of both parties in the U.S. have apparently found very threatening.
But I mean, it's that I mean, I just find it hard to believe that that's that much of a threat, only because the American public certainly has no awareness of these issues, broadly speaking. All due respect to my countrymen, but I mean, surely there has to be specific industries that are really worried about the democracy, because the democracy ends up leading to like, hey, wait a second, maybe some of the value of these resources should be focused on this country rather than on, corporate interests in some boardroom in New York or in London or wherever it is. Are there specific, is it basically just sugar? Are there other commodities, or are we looking for cheap labor? I mean, what do you, or is it a factor of all of those?
I've been working on Haiti now for 26 years, and I've been asking myself that same question, because we're used to thinking in terms of, we invade Iraq for the oil, or we overthrow governments in Central America over bananas. But in Haiti, there really isn't a single economic interest that would explain U.S. foreign policy. Yes, there's some mining. There's a little bit of sugar. There is assembly manufacture. But all of those are really, it comes to that this is a case that we are really worried about ideology, that we just do not want a progressive democracy to succeed. And I think you're right when you said that most Americans know nothing about what's going on in Haiti. I think you can probably say that, unless they're watching your show, about what's going on in the United States in terms of the limits of popular sovereignty and the unlimits of corporate power. And I think that if there really is just a concern that if Haiti is allowed to question the current unequal status quo, that could create, it goes back to Ronald Reagan and the domino effect. It could create a domino effect where other countries could insist on having a popular democracy, which would eventually pose an existential threat to elite rule in the United States.
I am often guilty of forgetting the precedent rule that very often is like, if you let one happen, then other countries start getting the ideas. All right,
which I think ties in well, just quickly, with the support for Guaido by Moïse, where he essentially backed the United States' position on recognizing Guaido as the leader of Venezuela, right? I mean, that's part of the calculus here too, right? I didn't mean to cut you off, Sam.
That's a big part, Emma. And that was something that was extremely controversial in Haiti. Haiti kind of they have a self-image of being on the side of the oppressed, on the side of progressive principles in international forum. And for President Moïse to kind of switch sides on that was shocking throughout Haitian society, that he was doing that basically because the United States wanted to, required him to, and he got the payback. I mean, he felt he needed to do that because he needed U.S. support against his people, and he got it. So it was a deal that that worked out for him and for the United States, in the sense that they were able to continue to gang up on Venezuela.
So, Brian, I mean, do you have a sense of who might be behind this? I mean, it sounds like it's not just a random situation, obviously. I mean, the political assassination of this ilk. Um, and on one hand, it throws the country into all sorts of chaos, which one can imagine it both, gets rid of a guy who was, at the very least, an aspiring dictator, it seems to me, if not a full-on one. But it also throws the country into chaos and allows for another dictatorial sort of impetus to rise, one that might be more durable and have a reset button. So it seems to me that it could have been. This serves the interests of maybe a wide, disparate number of players.
That's exactly it. It's very hard to tell why this assassination took place. There are many groups with a motive. There are many groups with a capacity to do a hit. Although people in Haiti are expressing shock that there was not much sign of resistance by President Moïse's security. If in fact that's true, then it was probably to some extent an inside job, and that's what there's a lot of speculation on Haiti. But there's just lots of people who have lots of guns and who could operate such an attack. So it's hard to say exactly why that happened. In terms of going forward, Haitians are really worried. I spoke with a human rights activist this morning who was a pretty staunch opponent of Moïse, and she said this is worse than we ever could have imagined. Right. So she's worried about things getting much worse, and I think that's a pretty broadly shared view. I think that Haitians, they didn't want President Moïse dead. They wanted him out of office and their democracy alive. And there's lots of risks of things getting worse. I think there is an opportunity for things to get better. And I think that's an opportunity for U.S. policy. It's an opportunity for Haitian voters. In order for that opportunity to be seized, the international community needs to make a decision. And again, the U.S. will take leadership on this. So if there is going to be support for this, it has to be the U.S. taking the lead on supporting a process that leads to fair, inclusive, and broadly accepted elections. What the risk is that the U.S. is going to again decide who it thinks can best lead Haiti and put all their support behind him.
Brian Concannon, Executive Director of Project Blueprint, advisor to Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for covering Haiti.
And folks, if you're watching us on Peacock, the Peacock app, we will say goodbye and see you tomorrow. For those of you who are not, oh boy, we have so much show left for you. It's crazy. It is crazy. We're going to head into the, I guess, should we head into the fun half or should we? Yeah, we're going to head into the fun half. We're just going to take a quick break. And coming up, I'm going to welcome to the program Yaron Brook. He is, as far as I know, the chairman of the board at the Ayn Rand Institute. And apparently he was the executive director from 2000 to 2017. So I suspect he's a big fan of Ayn Rand. But we will find out more when we come back. Just a reminder, it is your support that makes the show possible. Not only do you support the free show when you become a member, you get it commercial free. Although I think we're going to keep the Seder ad in there today.
I love it every time.
Tomorrow. We're doing that tomorrow. Sorry. And
I'm naming my first child Sebede.
And Sebede. And that's what I should have done. I should have named my child that. And then I could just talk about it all the time. Not
That's a really a creative way to get around the algorithm.
Yeah, probably not so great for the kid long term, but But also, if you become a member, you get the fun half. And boy, we're gonna have hopefully some fun today, and maybe learn something too when we speak with Yaron Brook. Also, don't forget Nomi's show now on Tuesdays and Thursdays at youtube.com/The Nomi Key Show. And Matt, what's happening in the Leckian media universe? All right, check that out, folks, and we will see you in the fun half.
You are in for it.
All right, folks, 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
Are you ready?
Who sent us this?
Anarchy.
Alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just as delicious as you could imagine.
The alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just want to degrade the white man.
Alpha males are back.
I take all of it to my throat.
Alpha males are back.
Snowflake says what?
The alpha males are back.
You are a madman.
And the alpha males are back.
Oh no, Sam Seder! What a fucking nightmare!
Bring back DJ Danner.
Yeah, or a couple of them. Just put them in rotation.
DJ Danner.
Well, the problem with those is they're like 45 seconds long, so I don't know if they're enough of a break.
That's fucking nonsense. You see white people doing drugs, they look worse than normal white people, and all white people look disgusting.
And the alpha males.
Psych. Fuck them.
Snowflake says what? Snowflake says what?
A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. Okay, I'm making stupid money. Hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. All lives matter.
Have you tried doing an impression on a college campus?
I think that there's no reason why reasonable people across the divide can't all agree with this. Psych.
And the alpha males are back. And the Africans are black African. And the alpha males are black. And the Africans are back.
When you see Donald Trump out there, doesn't a little part of you think that America deserves to be taken over by jihadists? Keeping it 100. Can't knock the hustle. Come on, fuck them. Things I do for the bigger game plan. By the way, it's my birthday. Happy birthday to me, Jew boy.
I have a thought experiment for you.
And the alpha males are back. Africans are black. Alpha males are black. Africans are back.
Come on. Come on. Someone needs to pay the price for blasphemy around here.
I am a total pussy.
We're back now.
We are back, ladies and gentlemen. Apologize for Matt's sound. I made a decision the other day that sometimes I'm going to randomly censor Matt and not let his sound carry through our devices. And therefore, there will be times where Matt will speak, and I have just deemed that he will be canceled. And that is censorship and First Amendment violation, and it's critical Matt theory. Critical Matt studies that we do around here. And
let me just reiterate really quickly, tonight, 8 Eastern, Austin of Machete Mate on Left Reckoning, talking about the Americas besides the States.
All right. So with Matt having done that, and maybe you heard it, maybe you didn't. We'll never know. But I'd like to welcome to the program Yaron Brook. He is the current chairman of the board at the Ayn Rand Institute, and he has his own show. Yaron, are you there?
Yep. Can you hear me?
There he is. Yes.
Okay.
So Yaron,
Yes.
tell us
It's
first of all,
Yaron.
thank you so
That's
much
okay.
for, what's that?
It's Yaron.
Yaron. I'm sorry. I'm famously very bad at pronunciation. Yaron, tell us the name of your show where people can check out your program.
It's pretty simple. Yaron Brook Show. Yaron is Y-A-R-O-N.
Okay. And so we should just say, to start this off, we were connected by Ben Burgess. I think in the wake of the Steven Crowder, I believe, debacle, or depending on your perspective, wonderful phenomena. You reached out to Ben and said, I would like to debate Sam, and I was down. And so here we are. Let me, well, I'm not going to make you comment on the Steven Crowder thing, because
let's move on from Steven
Crowder.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, all right. So, okay. So with this said, what shall we discuss libertarianism?
Well, I mean, I'll just clarify. I'm not exactly a libertarian, and I know this is probably in the weeds for you guys, but I like to differentiate myself from them. I'm not an anarchist. I'm not a complete subjectivist, as many libertarians are. But sure, we can discuss free markets, and we can discuss capitalism. We could discuss, debate them, however you want to present it.
All right. Well, I mean, let's start with free markets, because I am of the opinion that there's really no such thing as a free market, and that markets only really can exist, particularly in this day and age, but in general, with governments, essentially, that governments create and structure markets, and that there really isn't a free market. It's really just a question of how the market is structured in such a way and who it benefits.
Well, what's the question is what is freedom? That is, what does it mean to say there's a free market? Freedom is the absence of coercion. It's the absence of force. It's the absence of an authority that says this is how things have to be. And if you don't abide by the rules, we'd put you in jail, or we shoot you, or whatever. Free market is a system in which the governments exist, but the role of government is to protect rights, to protect individual rights. It's to leave you alone, to make choices based on your values, based on your pursuits, based on your choices, to leave you alone to do all that, and to protect you from other people who want to do you harm. So you need government because you need a monopoly over the use of force. But other than that, the government should leave you free. And that's what free markets mean. It means where the government is not dictating to you how you should live, what products to buy, how much to pay your employees, etc.
But I mean, do you think we have free markets in this?
No, I don't think we've ever really had free markets. I think we've gotten close to it. I think it's gotten close to it. And I think it's possible to get free markets in the future. And I think to the extent that we get towards free markets, to that extent, we're richer and better off and more flourishing.
I want to circle back as to who the we is in that, because
that'd be great. Happy to.
But where, like, what would you look at the market that we have for, let's say, labor and products and whatnot, and explain to us like what you perceive as the lack of freedom there, and what you think is obviously supported and structured by the government, but still represents freedom.
Oh, there's massive amounts of lack of freedom in labor markets, for example. Minimum wage is a lack of freedom. Requiring employers to pay benefits is a lack of freedom. The restrictions on firing and hiring, many of the discrimination laws are an example of a lack of freedom. Any intervention of the government in a voluntary activity, in a voluntary exchange between two individuals, that is not coerced, that is not illegal, but
what do you mean by illegal? I mean,
the only thing that should
labor
be
laws
legal is fraud.
are the law.
That's not fraudulent. That's not fraudulent.
That's not fraudulent.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, what about things like tax breaks, or what about what about, I don't know.
Well, I don't think there should be tax breaks. I think that if you're going to have a tax system, taxes should. I mean, taxes should be flat, and they should be as close to zero as possible, and they should be simple, and everybody should pay exactly the same. There should be no breaks.
There should be no progressive
corporations at the end of the day don't really pay taxes. They pass it on to consumers and they pass it on to employees. So corporate taxes make zero sense from anybody's perspective, because the economics of it is workers pay corporate taxes. It's just a hidden employment tax.
I mean, I don't think that's necessarily the case. But
every economic study out there shows that at the end of the day, the corporate tax is either paid by consumers in higher prices or by employees in lower wages. There is no such thing. Shareholders pay very little in corporate taxes.
Shareholders.
Then who pays? There is no such thing as a corporation. It's just a nexus of contracts, right?
No, I mean, the corporations will pay taxes on exchanges of goods. They will actually pay money to the government. You're suggesting that they just pass on all of those expenses. They may.
But there is no such thing as a corporation, Sam. Corporations are just people, right? So which are the people within the corporation that actually pay the tax?
Well, the entity.
But the entity, the cash sitting in the bank account of the entity is owned by shareholders, right? So if it's either shareholders are paying the tax or they pass it on
not
to
yet.
Well, but it's their property. Legally, it's their property.
It is not their money yet until it's passed on to them, and then which case the government takes a part. I mean, no more than, my money is Matt's money right now because I'm going to pay him in the future. It's not his money yet.
Well, to the extent that you have a contract with him, he has a claim against you.
But then I give money to the government as well at that moment.
They have a claim against you as well. Okay. So it's in that sense, it's their money.
And do you have and so you don't think that there's any type of coercion that is set up in between this relationship that is a function of government? For instance, like protecting property rights, like building infrastructure, like shielding those individuals who are surrounded by the corporation, which is a legal protection that the worker may not have. Do you see that as a government intervention?
So let's take them one at a time, right? So protecting property rights, no, all the government there is doing is protecting something that's mine. It's not the government's. The government is just recognizing the fact that I created something and it is now mine, and it's protecting my ability to use it. That's what property rights mean. Rights are not something the government grants you. It's something that is recognized. It's a principle of human interaction that the government is protecting. So rights are not things. Rights are freedoms of action. All rights mean is it's a recognition that you are free of coercion, and that the government's job is to protect that freedom. And property is the same thing. I own something, it's mine. The government is protecting my ability to keep it.
Okay. So the government, it's not just a question of the government recognizing your right. It is a question of the government deploying its power in defense of that right. And it's also defining that it's yours, right?
It's not defining it's mine. Reality defines that it's mine. It's a fact that it's mine. If I produce something,
Yaron, hold on for 1 second.
Yeah, go ahead.
If reality defines that something's yours, how is it that what is the use of, why do we have courts that very often have to step in to define whose this is?
Because we often disagree about things out of reality, right? I mean, we have courts to decide who murdered person X.
Well, but
even
let's not talk about murder.
In reality, somebody murdered him. Now it's a question of, do we know? And there's disagreement about what happened. So there are disagreements about property rights, and that's why you have a court system. But the fact is, somebody owns this stuff. Somebody created it, and therefore it is of somebody's.
But wait a second.
Before you had government, hold
on, wait. I want to just focus on this, because on one hand you say it is, we know who owns this because it's reality, but in fact you're also acknowledging that different people can have a different view of reality.
So we have disagreements. Yes.
Okay. We have disagreements about the reality of who owns this.
Yes. And one person's right and one person's wrong. And that's the job of the courts, is to help us decide that.
In other words, the government decides whose ownership, who's going to have that ownership right. And it's not just a function of you built this. I mean, property exists before you get there. But it can be, I created this, but we also have regimes for who owns the creation of that.
Slaves built quite a lot, for instance.
And so
that's not free
intervenes.
markets, right? We're talking about what would happen in the free market. So the fact that slave built something is I mean, the fact that slavery existed is evil and an abomination, but that's not what we're talking about, right? We're talking about under freedom, what happens to property rights. And what I'm saying is that you create, you know, you pay Matt a certain amount of money. That's his. That's a contract between you and him. You got to decide that Matt's worth X and he gets X. That is now all the government is going to do is say, okay, well, if there's a dispute between you and Matt, the government's going to say, what did Sam promise Matt? What is therefore Matt's? What is Sam's? Based on that promise. So the government is there to intervene when there's a disagreement between you. But the property rights allocation, the amount of money coming into you, and then the amount of money you give Matt is voluntarily decided between you and Matt. Matt has a property right claim against what you promised him. That's all. I mean, property rights are not that hard. They are, you work, you produce, and then you get stuff.
Yaron.
Yeah.
My father's an attorney, right? Whose entire career has been resolving these type of disputes. So
yeah,
it's
not
rather
easy.
complicated, but it's not just a question. It is the government that comes in and ultimately decides and shapes the property right. I mean,
sure. And that's why we want government. We want a government that is focused on doing a good job not shaping property rights, but recognizing property rights, doing it objectively, doing it transparently, and not getting bogged down with the millions of regulations and controls and millions of things that we have today. Rather, if we lived in a simple free market world, government would have one job. It would be relatively easy and things would be a lot simpler than they are right now. And your father would probably not have a job. Okay. I'm sorry, I don't mean your father, but there would be a lot fewer lawyers in the world, right?
I understand. So now what would that look like and how would that work? I'm very curious about that. If government was more in your aspirational view of the world, how would that work? How would we determine property rights, let's say?
Well, I gave you an example between you and Matt, right? So Matt would have a property right over what you paid him, right? The whatever contractually you promised to pay Matt, that's now his. And then if he went and he bought a home, there is a role for government to have a registry, but that's about it, of who owns what, so that there's not a lot of confusion about, who owns a piece of land. But that's it. There's no, he would buy it from somebody. Now it's his because he acted to gain it. And he could, as a consequence, do with it basically what he wanted. It was now his home.
Could he burn plastic on it?
Well, if the plastic was not harming his neighbors, if his neighbors were being harmed by the burned plastic, then they could sue him to prevent him from burning it. So, I mean, again, the common law is all, what's that?
Sue him in the government's courts.
Well, I'm not against government. I believe governments are necessary, and governments are there to protect you from harm. So they would have to sue him in the government's courts and show harm in order to stop him. So governments are there to do this one thing. So I'm not against the existence of governments. I think governments are wonderful things when they're very limited.
Yaron, I'm trying to figure out how your world is different than the one that we're existing in. Because when you say do harm, who defines that it's harmful?
So I'll give you an example.
Wait a second. So Matt and I don't know I don't know, sort of like at birth, that the inhalation of the burning plastics are going to do me harm. And maybe there are some plastics that he's burning that actually wouldn't do me harm. Mm-hmm. The government writes regulations and makes determinations through the EPA, let's say, that it does do harm. And that's the basis of my argument that his burning does harm there. How is this
to the extent
how is that world different? How that's your fantasy world. How is that different from our existing one?
The difference is this, that how much you pay Matt is not an issue of harm. How much you pay Matt is not an issue of harm. That's true. Burning plastic, if it really does harm, in some sense, your world and my world look the same. If there's harm, right? The way to prove harm might be a little different, but at the end of the day, if there's harm, it will look the same. If you beat Matt up, if you whip him, right? You try to enslave him. He brought up slavery before. Then the government would intervene to stop you from doing that, both in your world and in mine, right? But where the difference happens is your choice of whether to pay Matt's healthcare or not. Now, I don't know if you're required to pay him because maybe you're too small of a business to do so. I don't know how many employees you would need. But at some point, you know that there are hundreds, if not thousands of regulations that dictate how you and Matt should treat each other that have nothing to do with harm, have nothing to do with force, have nothing to do with coercion, have something to do with some kind of social policy. We believe that everybody should have health care. Therefore, the best way to do it is through employers, and we will force employers to provide that. My government would never do. If you want to pay Matt health care, you guys can negotiate. Maybe he prefers to get cash. Maybe he doesn't want you to pay his health care. You would have contractually, you would decide with Matt on that relationship.
Does your government have corporations? In other words, does your government give certain benefits?
So you raised the limited liability issue. So let's deal with the limited liability issue. I mean, the limited liability issue for the most part is a contractual issue. It is an issue that relates to the relationship between debt holders and shareholders. Basically, debt holders are saying, we're willing to lend you as a corporate entity money in exchange for not, and we know by doing this, it's in the covenants of the bond, that we can't go after the individual wealth of shareholders. That's a voluntary decision that they made. Now, the government has recognized that, called it a limited liability corporation, but it's recognized a contractual dispute. Now, you cannot lend, you can choose not to lend a corporation money because you think it's too much of a risk and you'd rather be able to actually go after the money of the shareholders. That's all it is. I mean, a big deal is made out of this, but limited liability basically is just a formalization of a market contract, a voluntary contract.
But Yaron, there may be voluntary, between the debt holder and the shareholder, but in terms of the corporation and the public, the public doesn't volunteer for any of that. I, as an S Corp, have certain protections that amongst people I've never even met before.
So what are you protected from? From people outside?
I'm protected from my personal wealth being sued. If I let's say I infringe upon someone's copyright, I pay that all in pre-tax dollars. If they come after me and they sue me, so I am
put aside taxes. Put aside taxes. I'm fine if you want to get rid of the limited liability that corporations have with regard to third parties.
Let's get rid of corporations.
With regard to third parties that do not have a contract with the company, sure. I mean, I don't think that's an issue.
I would also,
but the pre-tax stuff, let's put aside because, as I said, corporations don't actually pay taxes. Your employees do. But
well, I mean, they're pre-tax in relative to the pass-through.
I mean, I wish everything was pre-tax. I'm not a big fan of taxes, particularly not today.
I don't doubt that. But what of all the advantages that these entities get from society that workers don't necessarily get? Like, for instance, I am, I make my living on the internet, largely established by the government that becomes a commercial vehicle for me. I am a trucking company and I make my money through having high quality infrastructure in a way that I take advantage of that other people either don't have the resources to take advantage of or don't. There are, I mean, just the idea that I have that much more property that needs to be protected by the government is an advantage that I have over these, when I get into a contract theoretically with a worker, et cetera, et cetera.
So a few things. I don't believe government should build infrastructure. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it has been necessary historically. So in my world, you're asking about my world, right? The trucking company would not be writing off of what you had paid into through it. It would have to pay for its use of infrastructure through tolls or whatever to somebody who built the road, right? Through tolls or whatever. And I think tolling is pretty simple right now. I think all infrastructure could be built and be more efficient and be more productive on a private basis. Let me just say something about the internet. I mean, this mythology that the government built the internet is truly nuts. And while it's true that government funded university programs and academics and so on that ultimately created the basis on which the internet was built, sure. But if the government is going to fund something like university research, it funds a lot of university research. 90% of it is garbage and you never see. Once in a while, you see something that produces a result. And then we say, oh, the government did it. The government did very little of it. They funded randomly a bunch of research and some of it turned out to be good. Now, the idea that research wouldn't happen if not for the government is bizarre. Research was happening well before government started funding it. But it's true that once the government starts funding something, it crowds out everybody else. That is, you don't expect private funding of university research if the government is going to do it. Some of the biggest innovations in all of human history happened at a time when government was funding exactly zero research. And that was during the 19th century in England, in the United States, where there was no government funding of any research. And we got electricity, and we got the steam engine.
Where did that wealth come from,
airplanes, and so on. Matt, I'm sorry, I missed that.
Where did that wealth come from?
It came from people producing and creating and building.
And a little bit of like the triangle slave trade and all of that.
But the slave trade is wealth destroying. I mean,
it created wealth.
No, the wealth trade is wealth destroying. Let's be very clear about this. The South was poor, the North was rich. It's one of the reasons the North won. Slavery.
Hold on for 1 second.
Slavery, from an economic perspective, you keep raising slavery, so I need to answer this question. Slavery is first of all immoral and evil and so on, but it is a net economically destructive force. It is not a productive force. There would have been a lot more wealth created without slavery, and indeed much more wealth was created post-slavery than there was pre-slavery. So I know the easiest thing to do when the 19th century is raised is to say, but it's all slavery. But that's just an economic and historical fallacy.
I don't want to get. I want to stay on where we were.
So let me finish my point about the internet. So because Matt interrupted me, the point is that the internet, yes, some infrastructure with regard to the internet was produced by government. That would have happened even without the government. That is, there's plenty of capital flowing into research throughout the last couple of centuries without government flowing into it. So yes, so you would have to, you're using a private service. I assume YouTube is making a lot of money off of your show.
All right,
good for them.
Yaron, let me just address some of those. First of all, in terms of the slavery, I have interviewed at least a half a dozen authors who have written extensively that the Northern wealth was just as tied into the free labor and created the entire cotton industry, and it had knock-on effects throughout the world, including in Britain, because you had zero input in terms of labor, and cotton at that time was incredibly labor intensive to produce. And when you have the ability to produce that labor for nothing, virtually nothing, it has knock-on effects. But
can I just say one thing about that, and then I'll let you. Slavery has existed from forever. We've had slavery.
How about the triangle slave trade?
All right, Matt, please.
Slavery has existed.
Matt, please.
Slavery has existed forever. The fact is that something different happened in the 19th century, and it wasn't some innovation with regard to slavery. It was the discovery and the use of capitalism. And the fact that slave labor was mitigated. If you look at the actual wealth created during the 19th century, almost none of it was created as a consequence of slavery. And I know there's a massive political agenda of painting the 19th century in that way, but it is distortive and it is wrong. And if you look at the places in the world without slavery that has taken the same principles as capitalism developed in the 19th century in the United States, they developed wealth as fast, if not faster than the United States. So the slavery issue is just a massive perversion and distortion. And it's sad to see that is the critique of you know,
Okay.
a period that was.
Listen,
Yep.
we're gonna let's just
A lot of
table
work.
this because I've literally interviewed half a dozen people on
I
this
know,
who
and-
are
and-
experts at this who disagree.
Experts at a
but we will leave-
political angle on it.
Okay,
Absolutely.
okay,
I'm sure you haven't interviewed the experts that would mitigate that. That would say the opposite.
I have actually talked to many libertarians before who've made the similar argument,
Okay.
but without the data. But nevertheless, let's go back to just even your description of the internet. Now, your argument is a counterfactual that's impossible for any of us to argue, which is the internet would have existed even if the government hadn't spent all this money on research, which by the very expense of it is indicative of it is research that they're going out there and they're laying a lot of bets on stuff that doesn't necessarily pay off, which of course capital is highly reluctant to do. We see it in the context of the COVID, right? Like you would not have had without the billions of dollars that were pumped into these private entities, without the guarantee of distribution, even if this stuff doesn't work, you wouldn't have seen the COVID vaccines developed at the same rate, and you wouldn't have seen so many of them.
Sam, none of that is true. I mean, I encourage people to look at the critiques of the entrepreneur state. I mean, you're referring to a book called The Entrepreneur State, where she lays out the case of, or maybe you're not, but the case that the internet was funded by government. I encourage people to look at the critiques of the entrepreneur state and look at exactly what was funded, what was not funded, and what would have happened if free market, if those elements of that are still free in our markets hadn't stepped in and turned the internet into what we know of it today. I don't believe that's true of COVID either. The fact is that the only reason we have a vaccine today is the two companies were set up completely in the marketplace, not funded by government, Moderna and BioNTech in Germany, set up trying to do mRNA, trying to create mRNA technologies for all kinds of, and they were ready. They were ready.
Moderna was heavily funded by the NIH prior to this.
No, it wasn't funded by the NIH. Again, research on which Moderna later was funded by the NIH. Sure. Again, if the government is funding all research, you're not going to be able to find a company.
It's not funding all research. It's funding the research that is the longest shots. I mean,
no, that's not true.
Yaron,
it's exactly the opposite. So I'll give you one example. I'll give you an example of exactly what you're saying. When COVID was, when we discovered there was COVID out there were many researchers and scientists out there who wanted to jump in and try to get funds to do research and to develop drugs relating to COVID, in March of last year. And yet they couldn't, because the government bureaucracy was such that they couldn't get the grants, the grant authority wasn't there. They couldn't switch the authority from what they were doing to something else. The people who jumped in with the private sector, now it's true that the government stepped in and said, we'll buy everything that you produce. As if in a free market that couldn't have happened, right? As if in a free market, insurance companies don't have an incentive to do exactly that. I know you'll pull a face, but we can lay down a scenario where profit-seeking, profit-maximizing evil corporations actually seek to buy as many vaccines as they can because it's cheaper than actually paying for treatment in hospital, which is what would have happened in a free market. But look, we can argue about the factual and the counterfactual. To me, the deeper issue about free markets is not, can we draw these scenarios? Because I think, if you gave me enough time, I could draw you the exact scenario of what would happen under COVID and a free market, and a lot fewer people die than under the 600,000 that died in the world in which we have the government involved in it. The government was an obstacle at every step of the way. It didn't do its job. It didn't test, screen and isolate, which is its job. It wouldn't let private enterprise produce tests until it was way too late. The CDC insisted on making the test themselves, and it was a lousy test. And the vaccine distribution is a joke, centrally planned, was a complete abomination, could have been much more efficient if it was done in the free market. We could go over all of these in great detail, and I could present a counterfactual, and you'll say it's counterfactual, so who cares? But the essential is this. I don't believe that the government telling you what research to do. I don't believe the government building infrastructure. I don't believe the government getting involved in our lives is moral or right or just. The only government is force, government is coercion. The only time coercion and force is justified is in self-defense. And it has no business, the government has no business, the majority has no business in telling me what values to pursue, what education to get, what research to do. That are choices that need to be left to individuals and not to central planners.
All right, Yaron, let me, I'll get to the morality of this because, you know, we may have a different value system, but there's a couple of things I just want to go back to what you were saying about the infrastructure. The government doesn't need to pay the infrastructure. They could charge, the private entities could charge tolls for corporations who you would say at that point would then pass it on to take out of their workers' pay and charge to consumers, I would imagine, right? There's no reason why the toll is any different than a tax in that regard.
Well, any expense, a toll is just an expense, right?
Okay.
And
All
there's
right,
no
so fair
reason a
enough.
tax is not any
But-
kind of expense, right?
But
Somebody has
we
to pay.
also know that one of the things that, and maybe this is just a question of immorality to you, but we have roads that go to just about everywhere in this country. And we have, you know, for instance, mail delivery, you can send a letter regardless of how remote you are.
We even
from
have
one
bridges
place
to
another
nowhere.
place.
Right?
We have bridges to nowhere. It is true. There are definitely abuses within our system, like there is in any system, whether it's corporate or not. But the whole point is that private corporations will only seek profit. We know many, many stories. I'm sure you must know, have heard stories of medical inventions that are built that are maybe helpful to a very narrow amount of people, and their private corporations don't support it. I can tell you that living in an area where there was a tremendous amount of Lyme disease, there was a Lyme vaccine that existed 40 years ago that was about 70% effective, but it was just not profitable for the company at the time. And maybe there's one coming back now with some government intervention and support of that because the profit motive is such that it wasn't compelling enough. So we're going to see a Lyme vaccine in a couple of years now, apparently.
That's
But
really
that's an
bizarre,
example.
Sam, because if you think about the number of drugs that are being researched and being produced and being investigated, and the number the FDA approves, and the cost that the FDA, the amount of money that the FDA causes a drug to cost these days, the idea that it's private enterprise that is restricting drug supply and not the FDA and not government restricting drug supply is bizarre. And the fact is that, for example, I'll give you a quick example. There was a drug that people who had arthritis swore by this because they live in excruciating pain, and there was one drug that would actually reduce their pain. And the government stepped in and said, you know what, but 10% of you have an increase in heart disease, therefore we're withdrawing the drug, and it's illegal. Even if you choose to take on the risk of heart disease to reduce this excruciating pain, we, the government, have decided you cannot access this drug because we, the government, know what's good for you. So instead of me and my doctor making a decision based on risk that is personal to me, the central planner now dictates, no, 10% risk is too much, so the drug is off the market. The reason we have so few drugs in this country is because the FDA has an incentive to be super risk averse. It is going to be blamed for any damage that happens, but never blamed for a drug that's released that actually going to cure something or actually help us. This is all completely twisted. Profit motive is what gets us more drugs, not less drugs.
What is that drug?
Oh, I forget now, but it was like 10 years ago. It was on the market. It was a hugely popular drug, and they withdrew it because there was an increased risk, the 10% increased risk of heart disease in those receiving it.
What do you do about the problem that we had with, let's say, OxyContin, where doctors were making these decisions with their patients, but because of the intense profit motive and because of, frankly, in some respects, the failure of the FDA and the fact that the statutory protections were not strong enough, in my opinion, that we ended up having this use and ultimately abuse of OxyContin that led to a massive opioid epidemic.
So I, for one, believe that drugs should be legal. And if people want to abuse them, they have every right to abuse them. It's sad.
No, but the point is the doctors gave excuse me, wait. The doctors, you said this should be a decision between the doctor and the patient. And I'm suggesting to you that a significant part of the overdose that we see in the addiction was not a function of people making a choice to be addicted or to abuse drugs, but was rather a profit motive on the part of Purdue and subsidiary.
Sam, have you ever had surgery? I'm just curious. If you ever had surgery and been in intense pain?
I have been in intense pain. I have friends.
And when the doctor offered you,
let me finish.
When the doctor offered you an opioid,
what did you do? Let me just finish.
Go ahead.
The profit motive drove these salespeople and this company to make doctors believe that this was not addictive in the way that the doctors understood OxyContin could be, or that this type of opioid could be. You're shaking your head. I mean,
I'm shaking my head because no doctor believed it wasn't addictive, and particularly they couldn't believe it after they actually saw their patients come back over and over and again to ask for more. So maybe initially you're right, but at some point you have to ask.
We have a tremendous amount of corrupt doctors in this country.
And we have a lot of corrupt doctors in this country.
That to allow, listen, Yaron, just listen to what you've just said in the 2 minutes.
I know.
You have said we need to allow doctors to have an unfettered relationship with their patient, and all of these doctors knew they were giving a highly addictive drug to their patients, and they turned the other direction, which led to incredible.
I think that's right, but look,
actually,
so why am I suggesting we should trust doctors? Yeah, because I think we live in a system where we encourage people not to take personal responsibility, doctors and patients not to take personal responsibility for the decisions that they make, and we encourage corruption. I think because we have an SEC, for example, we have more corruption in financial markets. I think because we have an FDA, we have more corruption.
Let's say that
we have more corruption among doctors because doctors now rely on guidance from above rather than making personal decisions. Now, let me just finish this point about OxyContin. Look, when a doctor offered me, this is years ago, when a doctor offered me opioids after back surgery because I was in intense pain, I said, maybe not, right? These are addictive, right? I knew that. You knew that. Everybody knows opioids are addictive. Everybody knows opioids are addictive. And what we do is we shrug off.
Who's ever been addicted to that pain medication?
Yeah, and they rationalize it away, but they knew what they were doing. They knew what they were getting into,
really?
And it reduced their pain, so it was excusable, and they could, they could justify it to themselves because the pain was going away. But it doesn't take much research to discover. You just do a Google search. Even 5, 6, 10 years ago, and you would have discovered that any one of these drugs was addictive. We don't want people to take personal responsibility. We don't want doctors to have personal responsibility about the decision that they make.
Let me ask you this.
We want to give that decision authority to some guiding authority like the FDA.
Is mRNA vaccines, are they safe?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, I mean, if I Google it, I can find just as many hits. Well, no,
yeah,
you're saying that it's
use your mind a little bit. You can differentiate between the conspiracy theory nonsense and the reality.
I just want to be clear on what your argument is here. Your argument is that the literally tens of thousands of deaths that we've had as a function of addiction that started with OxyContin, you're arguing that the doctors were unscrupulous and the patients failed to understand the implications of the medicine they were taking. And that, okay, this is where our worldviews really diverge, because I don't believe that we can have a functioning society where every patient each has to know the implications of every medication they're taking so they can fact check the doctor who apparently is willing to be unscrupulous to the extent that they can because they're aided and abetted and encouraged to be corrupt by the existence
So
of
I don't
government agencies.
I don't disagree with you. That would be a rotten world, but I don't believe that's the kind of world you would get. I believe that is a world that we have gotten because of the kind of role we've allowed government to take. We have delegated to government authorities so much of our personal responsibility, both as doctors, as pharmaceutical companies, and as individuals, that yes, you cannot just take the world as exists today and snap your fingers and yes, everything happens. Incentives matter. And when you create perverse incentives, which is what the FDA has created, you get perverse results. And that's what we got. And you're getting the same with mRNA right now. The reason there's so much conspiracy theories about this is because people have lost trust in our government, and you get one central authority saying thumbs up, thumbs down. And we're living through that. It's a sad and horrific state that we have right now, where we're not trusting scientists, because scientists are believed to be members of some kind of elite.
You've just described the entire opioid epidemic as a function of unscrupulous
I think it's a function of the system that we have today, which involves the FDA and unscrupulous doctors. Yes.
And ignorant patients. But you're suggesting, in the absence of the FDA and the government, that everyone would trust Pfizer, or that they would all do the right thing, because why? How would the incentive structure be different?
Because first of all, think about what happens if you don't. Think about how you go out of business and how much you suffer when you go out of business if you screw it up. It's a big deal. But let's
wait a second.
Let's take that world.
That because that's an interesting thing, because I'm thinking about the builders of that building in Florida.
Sure.
Now, maybe they would take a hit now if we knew who they were. Maybe they're still in business. But it also suggests that the way that corporations, which we know, and you've made it clear, are just people who have a legal protection. Those people, 10 years down the road, they're gone. That CEO and that C-suite, they're gone, and they've profited from it. So if the company goes bankrupt, because the Sacklers made billions.
Yeah, they don't have them. They don't have those billions anymore.
Oh, they do. They very much do.
They don't, and they were pretty well up even before this.
I literally just interviewed the guy who did the story on the Sacklers. They very much do have billions of dollars.
But again, I don't think they are the only party responsible for what happened there, and a lot of people are getting off the hook on it. But
then everybody gets off the hook. Like, the point is,
there's no guarantee in life. Look, we have the system you want, or close to it. And a building inspector went into that building and returned every 10 years. The government sent a building inspector into the building in Miami, and they still didn't get it. They still blew it up.
No,
and I would argue
the private owners of that building did not respond
but that's
to
the point. The point is this: that in a world in which the government doesn't have a building inspector, let me finish this thought. And then I have to run, unfortunately, right? Because I don't have a lot of time. Let me finish this thought. In a world in which I imagine there are many people that have a clear interest in keeping the building from collapsing. Certainly the owners of the building and the people who live there. Now, look, mistakes are going to happen in any system. Mistakes are going to happen, right? No system is going to guarantee that no buildings ever collapse. No system is going to guarantee that no people ever get sick from a drug or sick from food that they eat. But I like the incentives of the building owners, the people who own the condos, more than I like the incentive of the building inspector from the government. Now, it didn't work in this case. It didn't work in this case, but I said that sometimes things are not going to work. But you know what? I also like the incentive of, in a free market, not in the world in which we live now, where everybody hides behind the government, of the insurance company that insured that building. Because they've got a lot of claims that they're going to have to pay now, and they're going to take a big hit. In a free market, they would have sent an inspector. Now, in the world we live in today, they don't, because they rely on the government inspector, which probably was not a good idea.
No,
because
the government inspector made it quite clear that there were problems there. The private inspectors, I'm sorry,
20 years ago when the building was built with a basis.
I'm sorry. The private inspectors also, the engineering company that was in there, the private owners of that building, made the decision not to fix it. Now, were there stricter government regulations?
Then why are we worried about it? Then they made a decision and they suffered the consequences.
Because there's 100
people who made a decision, who made a bad decision and suffer the consequences of it. I'm not justifying the building collapsing. I'm saying that people make decisions. If I make a decision to walk into the street without looking, should the driver be limited in his capacity to drive because I made a stupid decision? The point is that there are, what you want is for the people who make the decision to suffer, to benefit from the consequence of their actions. If I make a decision to take OxyContin, knowing it's addictive and I become addicted from it, that's my problem, not yours and not mine, and not anybody else's. I believe people should pay for the mistakes that they make.
I think that we have gotten to the rub between us, that for you, the morality, as far as I can tell, is that consequences, if they can be directly attributed to a mistake that individuals make, that's just the way it is. For me, my morality, I guess, to use your term, is that society should try and diminish and mitigate the suffering of other people.
That's a big difference between us. My view is if you want to mitigate the suffering of other people, you should be able to do that freely. To force me to help you mitigate the suffering of other people because it's your value, but if it's not mine, that is immoral. It's immoral for you to impose your morality on me, even if you're in the majority.
I have to say too that not every, but many of the conversations I've had with libertarians, the ones who are more coherent, and I count you as one of those, ultimately comes down to there's a certain frustration that they have that the vast majority of Americans subscribe to the idea that society should mitigate mistakes that people make, like things like, and that society should be designed that way, and that it is frustrating for people like you to live in a country where most people feel that way.
Oh, absolutely. We try to educate people not to feel that way. But yes, I would like to live in a place where people are free to aggregate their efforts together to mitigate problems that they see fit on a voluntary basis. I don't believe in coercion. I just don't believe in force. I don't believe anybody has a right to force somebody else
except
to do something
to protect property.
That is protect. I'm all for protection. I'm protecting your life. Police should protect your life. I think property is an extension of your life. But property is part of your life. I mean, you can't separate the two.
Wait.
If I need to produce stuff in order to live.
What about government protecting your life if if the building falls? Like, because not every one of the 150 people who died in there made that decision.
Sure.
The children didn't. They were shareholders of a building, and they had representatives.
The shareholders are owners, and they're responsible for the decision making the decisions they make. But it's to protect your life from somebody else using force against you. It's not from nature. I mean, a hurricane might blow through here. I'm in Puerto Rico right now, and I don't expect the government to protect me from the hurricane. I do expect the government to protect me from somebody trying to shoot me in the street.
Did the government help putting electricity back on there?
Well, the government destroyed the electricity grid, and then it rebuilt it in as bad of a shape as it was originally. So the next hurricane it will go out again.
Was that drug, incidentally, people are saying it was Vioxx. Is that the case?
Vioxx, yes. Thank you. It was Vioxx.
Yeah. My understanding is that was a recall that they did themselves, but but maybe that's incorrect.
No, it's the FDA forced them.
Vioxx had been taken by some 4 million Americans. Out of those patients who took Vioxx, the arthritis drug may have caused approximately 140,000 heart attacks, resulting in an estimated 60,000 deaths. This is according to an FDA investigation. I mean,
may have caused, notice may, I mean, imagine if they did that with the vaccine, may have. And also, why can't I make that decision? Why can't I make decision whether I want to take the risk of the heart attack
You're a much smarter guy than most people who have the ability to assess all these different drugs.
I don't assume that. I actually have a high opinion of most human beings and think that they can make decisions for themselves. And I think it's the philosopher king mentality, the philosopher king mentality of Plato, where you get to decide for other people what's good for them.
You're right. You have kids?
I do. I have 2 boys.
I mean, you know, when you have little kids, it's a little bit tough to be doing all that medical reading, right?
It's absolutely tough. It's absolutely tough. And part of the reading is finding a good pediatrician so that somebody you can trust who's not going to deceive you. And that's not easy. I'm not saying life's easy.
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed.
No, it's not about fingers crossed. It's not about fingers crossed. But okay, well, I do need to run.
I know. I appreciate it.
I appreciate the time and I appreciate the stability. Thank you.
That was fun.
Yeah, it was.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right. Well, there you have it, folks. I mean, I think that was, I thought, incredibly civil. And I think Yaron ultimately presented a vision for life, what it would be like. Bone up on your drug manufacturing, folks, and on your medical treatments.
And bone up on the buildings that you live in. You may not be made aware that there are structural issues. You may not know, but you should know. You should know, right?
Sam, you were free to go check all those buildings in Miami to help those people on your own if you wanted to. Why are you trying to make Yaron help you on that?
Your own. I finally got it right by the end. But yes. So, folks, your lesson for today. Bone up on medicines, bone up on medical procedures, structural engineering. While you're at it, mechanics, you wouldn't want to buy a car that is going to blow up on you. Also, folks, bone up on your capacity to do data across, because Matt, you got to get a spreadsheet going to determine that there is a relationship possibly between Vioxx and those 60,000 deaths. So I want a spreadsheet.
Those people knew what they were doing, Sam. Come on. You know you might have a heart attack, surprise, if you take Vioxx.
It's just consequence of freedom.
So you're telling me that there is this is my conversation with my doctor, because the doctor's going to be like, I'm going to prescribe to you something that there's a lot of evidence out there. Now, of course, this evidence doesn't exist until people start dying. So you can't really know until the people start dying. But if you are, let's say, a couple of years into Vioxx being out there, and you're the doctor, and you say, look, here's the deal. It's only about 2.5%, 3%.
That assumes
3
that
out of 100 people I prescribe this to are going to have a heart attack.
Thereabouts.
But only half of you are going to die. Here it is.
Also, if doctors are corrupt, he might not even tell you that. He might just say, hey, look at this great new opioid they made that isn't addictive. Try this.
Right. And then the best doctors the non-corrupt doctors, they'll be the ones that rise to the top, and the corrupt doctors will also rise to the top because people who want the addictive substance will just go to them.
Folks, you got a lot of reading to do, incidentally. Oh, and then, of course, you got to go and... this corporation, if you work in a small town, let's say like one of those miners are on strike right now, man, you're in big trouble. Because that is
I just want to I know it's unfair to drag libertarians into slavery, but slavery wasn't just in the southern states. It was more pronounced in the South because that's where the big field crops that you could hire or not hire, own 300 people to work the fields. But in all the domestic situations in the North and the major families, those were all slave owners as well.
Right. And the fact that slavery was bigger and more prominent in the South was not just a coincidence. It was not because just simply, Southern people, it was because that's where you could really exploit that free labor in a commercial setting.
Yeah, and
right?
Yeah, free that profit from those laborers, basically. That's what set all this in motion. And it's interesting that libertarians are less interested than Marxists are in tracing that profit.
It's fascinating. I mean, it's fascinating. There's a lot of work that is being done. You got to really, and then the idea that I don't know, the reason why I have these debates is ultimately to allow particularly libertarians like to really just set them up so that what they're suggesting is explicit. Because on a very surface level, the idea of like, I want to be free to be you and me, man, that's, who's got a problem with that? But ultimately, when the morality, and it's interesting, it's fascinating to me that they talk about it in the context of morality. When the highest moral value involves no empathy or recognition of human suffering that they're not directly responsible for, I feel like that's it. That's your in the starkest point. I mean, we can go through like, how would this actually function? Like his world didn't sound terribly different than mine. He just stopped talking about stuff at one point. Like, well, if there's a dispute, we'll just resolve it in the courts. Well, but based upon what precepts? Laws? Well, yeah, there'll be laws that will deal with it. Like this always happens with libertarians. They just decide to stop the conversation at one point because they literally don't want to watch the rubber meet the road on the practicalities of the society that they aspire to. But put that aside, because that's almost like a side dish. The main component is what Ron Paul said on stage in I think it was the 2008 debates. Somebody doesn't get health insurance and they haven't lived their life in such a way that they can afford it, and they die on the street. That's just one of the features of society. Now, I guess it would be a private entity that would come and pick the body up. I don't know who would pay them at that point to dispose of the body. That might give other people, I guess we would all pay fees to a private company to make sure that that body that dies on the street doesn't give us some type of disease. But we could also call that taxes. And we could also call that entity, the government that comes and picks that body up off the street. But just that is presented as a moral choice is fascinating to me. But there it is. Well, I guess
it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much more to say.
Doing a freebie. I guess we're doing a freebie Wednesday.
No, we're in the fun.
Okay, I lost time. I'm sorry, Matt, for snapping at you, but like,
no, I understand.
He would have you want to slide. That there's a lot of like, move on to the next topic quickly because we can't go too deep into any one of these things.
I know, and he had a time limit, and like you only got to cornering him like right at the end, right? Because he wanted to run through all of these, theoretical examples first.
Yeah, well, maybe I can do a separate historical debrief with libertarian callers in the future.
Yeah, or fun. I imagine Yaron would also be willing to come on with you, and you guys
come on Left Reckoning. Yeah,
there you go.
All right, let's do a couple of these clips, shall we? Well, I don't know what's the most disgusting of these, frankly. Jesse Waters and Tucker Carlson. Brendan,
well, Tucker really went off last night. Yeah.
On which part?
I mean, the teachers.
Yeah. Okay. Let's do this. Now, if you listen to some quarters that are very concerned about the authoritarianism that is coming from the liberal Democrats,
the elites
that is out there, the elites, but
somehow
also
Hollywood's in this too.
Hollywood, the elites, the liberal Democrats, the MSNBC viewers, like these people, they're authoritarian. And how do they manifest this? Well, they criticize people who say things that may be racist, or they don't want to go see their movies or their TV shows, or, criticize them in general. Well, here's Tucker Carlson saying, well, oh, you think that's authoritarian? Hold my beer, and then ignore the fact that I've just had you hold my beer.
I'll drug you with this beer.
Overwhelming majority of Americans and pollsters have found this pretty clearly, think this is insane. They think you should judge people by what they do, not on the basis of their skin color. They believe in Martin Luther King. So it is BS. In fact, it's more than that. It's civilization-ending poison. But it's everywhere. How widespread is it? Well, we can't really be sure until we finally get cameras in the classroom as we put them on the chests of police officers, until we finally get a civilian review board in every town in America to oversee the people teaching your children, forming their minds. And let's hope we get both of those very soon. But until we do, we can't know exactly how widespread this is. But there are indications. We know that these ideas, this poison, has made it all the way to expensive private schools in central Ohio.
What? Okay, so here's the premise. There is anti-white mania that has gone crazy at this private school in Ohio. And therefore, to find out how deeply this anti-white mania has permeated our society, because you would think that anti-white mania, you'd be pretty aware of where it is, right? I mean, I'm white. And if there was an anti-Sam mania everywhere, I would be pretty aware of it. We need to spy on every classroom in the country and have independent review boards of what the teachers are doing. Sometimes they call them school committees.
Sounds like big government. No, I don't know.
It sounds like Big Brother.
Yeah.
I mean, really big government.
Well, I mean, right. Well, they're against it with cops, but now they're for it with teachers. It's interesting.
And just to be clear, that's not authoritarianism. That is just standing up for the little white guy, I guess.
Well, I mean, like you've made this point a few times, Sam, about how they keep tying, this fear about children being indoctrinated and children being outside the home. That's part of the QAnon fears and the anxiety that motivates that. Because really the underlying premise of, oh, your children are being sexually assaulted or abused potentially by these elites or by whoever the case may be, it's based in like this fear of women being outside of the home and the family structure kind of falling apart. And if you could pull up this tweet by Matt Walsh, I mean, this just tying into like he was backing up what Tucker Carlson said there. He's insinuating that very thing. Basically saying lots of people are upset at me for proposing that we put cameras in the classroom, but no one has offered any intelligible argument against it. That's because their real objection, which they won't say, is that they simply don't want you to know what is happening to your child. I mean, that works on two levels, right? It works on the level of we're going to create this anxiety about anti-white indoctrination, but also what's really happening to your child. I mean, that's kind of the B-level messaging behind that.
I mean, just to be clear, first off, I am all in favor of imposing government officials and monitoring of what's going on in these private schools. Let's start there, since we know it's happening in Ohio. And we will start there with the imposition in these private schools, and then we'll roll it out across the country. Of course, that's a great way to expend our resources with those teachers. But this is when Corey Robin wrote that book about the reactionary mind. This is what he's talking about. None of this is new. I mean, back in 2006, David Horowitz wrote, about the 100 most dangerous professors on college campuses around, and they were setting up like a mechanism to report on your college, on your professors. And then, what's his face is doing it for Turning Points USA. They're doing the same thing. This is all this is all the same. It's just that it's become even more explicitly racialized. The idea that there is an anti-white mania in this country, when you look back on, like, if there's an anti-white mania that's going on in this country, like, what do you call the anti-blackness that has permeated every day of the, like, it's like a hypermania? Like, Like how does this anti-white mania manifest itself? The idea that
a race war. I mean, that's what he's trying to insinuate. Yeah. It's also just it's so ironic that he's advocating for surveillance of teachers when he was just crying for multiple segments on being surveilled by the NSA. Not that he cared at all when it was being done to regular people systemically, but more surveillance for thee, but not for me, because I am the Tucker Carlson and I summer in the, in Florida with George Bush, and I got my studio in Maine.
I don't want this segment to turn into, but there are elements of people out there who look at Tucker Carlson, who this is literally him saying we need to impose some type of speech code on teachers.
Yeah, it's reactionary ideological discipline, just like McCarthyism of Hollywood.
Exactly. And to think about the people who go on and sort of praise Tucker Carlson and ostensibly are about free speech and are ostensibly about, not obscuring class, but in being anti-identity politics. I mean, the idea that you're going to get on TV and talk about anti-white mania, and that is the way that you don't deal with, I eschew identity politics, but I got to tell you, there's a secret race war that is taking place against white people in this country, and you've got to be aware of it.
And I'm going to make it, it's going to dominate my coverage every single night. It's funny too, how like those same people who embrace whatever anti-elitism that Tucker espouses are just entirely silent on that. Like the crux and the fleshy like center of his show is all just that. But that's, it goes by the wayside when it fits people's cable news agendas.
Yep. Let's check this out. Did you know we have listeners in Texas, which of course is a bastion of Marxism, but not just like, I'm not saying that there are teachers who are practicing Marxism or espousing it. I'm not saying that Austin DSA is, handing out pamphlets about Marxism. I'm talking about the Texas state government and their tax system.
Texas has other obstacles as well. Reliable power generation, property taxes through the roof, taxpayer-funded lobbying, and unaccountable government-run schools. Huge issues in the state of Texas. How are you going to address those things specifically?
Well, let's talk about property taxes, and it is unconscionable to me that here in the state of Texas, we have a system of taxation that is really based upon Karl Marx's communist planks in the Communist Manifesto. Number one, it's a progressive income tax, and it's a tax that is against your property, and Karl Marx talked about the elimination of private property. And that's exactly what you have here in Texas, and that you can never
truthfully own your home.
Can you pause it for a second?
Sorry. Marx, the Marxist take on that is that you don't want to rely on taxation as a policy because you basically rely on those industries remaining forever. You're not getting rid of them. You're dependent on them to finance your state. So not Marxist, really, almost fundamentally.
And I would also add, just since we're pausing for a second, that if you were to take away the property, there would be no means to tax, which I guess is really. So it seems like, it's an interesting stark choice that Al West has presented to the state of Texas.
I mean, when you say Texas has a Keynesian tax system, it doesn't quite hit as much, I don't think.
Exactly. Continue.
Taxation is levied against your property. And think about, the Declaration of Independence talked about life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. It was John Locke, the real father of classical liberalism, that said the inalienable rights that came from natural rights theory was life, liberty, and property. And here we don't allow people to own their property. So I think first and foremost, we start looking at how we reduce the size and scope and the expansion of the state government. We can turn those funds that we save back to property tax reduction. But we've got to go back and start looking at the original form of taxation we had in America before we were taxing people based upon their income. It was a consumption-based tax. And I'd like to sit down and put together an economic team, and we can start looking at how we can bring a consumption-based tax here to the state of Texas so that Texans can own their own home.
Yeah, Texas has no income taxes, so.
I love how he also had to go like, well, the Declaration of Independence said this, and it didn't include property. So let me talk about somebody who rhymes with liberty, and he talked about property. The consumption tax, of course, is pretty regressive because folks who are living in low income, they got to spend all their money on necessities. I wonder if you would just do a luxury tax. But I don't know. I mean, if you're maintaining property and you're keeping people off it, aren't you in some way consistently consuming that property? You're using it. But I guess that wouldn't satiate him. He's running against Abbott because Abbott is too
Yeah, he
too moderate for him.
too liberal, right? I mean,
Yeah.
obviously when he implemented Marxism.
Let's see if we got something else that we can. Should we do Laura Ingraham? I mean, this is all, part of a whole. I mean, it's almost the same clip over and over again in some respects, because this is, when they talk about critical race theory, what they're really talking about is even the slightest bit of reckoning with the racism and which, was foundational to this country. And here's Laura Ingraham. She is super mad still about these Confederate statues.
Remember when we told you that it was not just the a Confederate flag that they objected to last year? It wasn't just the Confederate monuments that they objected to. Well, we told you that it was all a Trojan horse for what they really wanted to take down: America herself, starting with our national flag.
Whoa.
There was this heartwarming news story by New York Times reporter Sarah Maslin-Neer. Marlene Rodriguez said that she once regularly flew the flag at her home in Freeport, taking it down only in winter for safekeeping. But about 3 years ago, when spring came, Ms. Rodriguez, who is black and a Democrat, left the flag in storage. It hasn't come out since. It felt like it didn't belong to me anymore, she said. And Washington Post columnist, as that's what you call him, Philip Kennicott, celebrated July 4th by attacking Lady Liberty. Why not? It is ambiguous and ambivalent, meaningless or foreign, a symbol of hypocrisy or unfulfilled promises. Then PBS, they just oozed national unity when during the national fireworks display, Vanessa Williams sang the Black national anthem.
I dedicate this to my ancestors, to our new federal holiday, Juneteenth. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty.
I like this one better.
A beautiful woman and a beautiful voice, but come on. This was never about some old monument to the Confederacy. And it wasn't about the flag, the Confederate flag. It's about the ultimate hatred of the left of all things traditionally American. And
yeah, it's interesting that she has a picture of Cori Bush up there, and well, I guess Chris Hayes made an
Wearing a
appearance.
tux, smoked salmon, socialist, that guy.
Yes, obviously, but not traditionally American.
Traditionally American things like the Confederacy, which broke off and tried to create a second country.
That's right.
Distinct from America.
Like the revolution. What could be more American than that? Rebellion. And
Beautiful
also,
woman, beautiful song, but
come on, she's not white, so can she really be singing on 4th of July? I mean, there you go.
I mean, I have no idea, but I would imagine that in whatever event that they were celebrating the 4th of July, that they also sung the regular national anthem. They just did the Black national anthem in addition, and Laura Ingraham's producers picked that out as a part of like a four-part, speed round where they did PBS, Cory Bush, the Vanessa Williams. It's just bizarre.
And of course, they probably did not introduce it as the Black national anthem.
Right. Yes.
I would imagine we would have heard that. All right, let's do some IMs and then we will get going. Hey Sam, in Yaron's libertarian paradise, how would anyone have time to innovate anything new? Have you ever talked to a specialist? Ask them basic stuff about banking, how their mortgage gets paid, what food is healthy. Literally clueless. In Yaron's world, you'd literally spend every day of your life trying to learn the truth about what's already out there, and you wouldn't even have time to work, let alone innovate or invent something new. Can I get a shofar for my birthday? Terry from California. Yes, indeed, you can. Let's see. Where the heck are they now? Here we go. Aaron is not cool. Stephen Curry, you say? JR, would Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema have more power without the filibuster? Wouldn't they have more power without the filibuster? Senate Dems would have to come to them for every major vote, and they would have much more leverage. I'm having trouble understanding why they want to keep the filibuster. I think the point is they don't want to be taking a vote on certain things. They don't want to have to actually take a vote on these things. And the way they can avoid it is that's that. They still have a decent amount of power. California Uber allies, the video of Walmart shoppers spontaneously singing the national anthem is very eerily similar to the Beigarten scene from Cabaret, where the Hitler Youth Boy leads the crowd in singing German patriotic folk songs. Majority Report wardrobe consultant, not sure if this was reported, but Mark Brown, current Buffalo mayor, has refused to concede and is launching a writing campaign after losing his primary to India. Wow, I had no idea. There was talk of a couple other local officials launching writing campaigns as well. Look at all that uni.
Yeah, I saw Ben Dixon was covering this.
Oh, I didn't see that.
Yeah, this was what, percolated after AOC won her primary. Crowley was kind of saying, oh, maybe I'll flirt with, being on the Working Families Party ticket. Not that I think it would have mattered that much, but this is a lot more real because India won by less of a margin. And then, if it becomes a three-way race with a Republican in the fall, that's bad.
Yep. Militant apathy. I can't help but think about how Roberts and Alito were appointed by Bush, a president who didn't win the popular vote, and Gorsuch and Barrett and Kavanaugh were also appointed by a president who didn't win the popular vote. When they are done, what Republicans actually want what do Republicans actually want the country to look like? Indeed. Yes. This dude is saying to people who had condos, there should have had all been civil engineers. Yes. I mean, the fact is that there was a financial incentive for them not to do the work. Is basically what it came down to. And tighter government regulation would have been like, you do the work or you move out, period, end of story. Glass-Steagall, I tuned in today for an update on the Twitch feud between Plop and John Wears Hats, but I guess he went a different direction with those interviews. Barrett home too. Sam, please ask what he thinks about Crowder avoiding you. Can't hear Matt. Right-handed. Okay, feeling less guilty about calling him a libertarian Elmer Fudd after his moronic take on slavery. Benny Boy, this guest is incredibly loud. Kid tested, Politburo approved. Libertarians view other humans as obstacles and have no interest in a society that benefits the population. It's all about protecting acquired wealth through any means necessary. Indeed. That is absolutely correct. Trombone guy. So it's immoral for forcing you to do something with which you disagree. Then fine, stop using my roads. It's immoral for just clown to use the roads. What a moron. I mean, that's the other thing. Like, okay, don't use the roads. Get your jetpack. Fairchild. Tucker Carlson needs to do a children's program like Mr. Rogers. Okay, 3 more, and then we're out of here. Shelby from Phoenix. I believe your master debater was referring to Vioxx. It was a non-steroidal taken off the market for doubling the risk of heart attack. It was voluntarily removed by the company. Doctors learn about medications through pharmaceutical reps. So many doctors are misinformed, if not corrupt. Indeed. Cower with Crowder. Who does he think helped the movement to not trust any sort of experts? It was his ilk. Does he realize that corporations lie about their products? Look at the tobacco companies. They hired researchers to make up studies.
Look at the Hoover Institution.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's all over the place. And the final I am of the day, ladies and gentlemen, comes from, let's see here, MSNB Seder. Sam, are you going to renegotiate your employment contract with Matt that allows you to whip him? Stop it, Sam, stop infringing on my freedom to have intensely research every currently somewhat minor decision in my life. Government is dumbing us down by providing regulations that make commerce easier. Bad Faith has Nathan Robinson and Glenn Greenwald debate whether Glenn is a useful idiot for the right. I sleep. Sam corners a libertarian into complaining about empathy being a shared human value. I am in. All right, folks. Matt, Brendan, Emma, great job today. Emma's here tomorrow. See you tomorrow.
It might take all the strength I got to get to where I want, but I know somehow I'm gonna get there. I wasn't looking when I just got caught between the truth and the lie bar. But finding out won't make me feel any better. Yeah, I know.